The siren cut off abruptly, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the red and blue lights still washing over the sidewalk. Night air hung damp and metallic. A single patrol car idled at the curb, engine low, impatient. The officer stepped out slowly, deliberate, boots pressing into concrete as if marking territory. Across from him stood a black man in a dark uniform, posture straight, hands visible, unmoving. The officer didn't ask for a name. He didn't ask for identification. His eyes moved first, scanning, judging, settling into something colder. "You fit the description," he said, voice flat, already certain. The man answered calmly, explaining he had just finished a late shift, that he was walking home. His tone was measured, respectful, practiced. It didn't matter. The officer circled once, close enough for the body camera to catch the scrape of fabric. He stopped in front of the man and leaned in. "You look tired," he said. "Weak." The word landed with intent, sharp and casual at the same time, as if it had been waiting all night to be used. A pause followed, long enough for a phone across the street to rise slightly, its screen glowing, long enough for a bus to hiss past and keep going, long enough for dignity to be tested. The man did not react. He did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. His face remained calm, eyes steady, absorbing the insult without surrendering to it. The uniform he wore was clean, pressed, unfamiliar to the officer's narrow assumptions. On its shoulder, partially hidden by the angle of the streetlight, were 4 small stars stitched in muted thread. They went unnoticed. "Hands on the wall," the officer ordered, already reaching for his cuffs. The command was automatic, rehearsed. The man complied without protest, palms flat against brick, still warm from the day. A passerby slowed, then stopped. Another phone appeared. The night was beginning to watch. "You people always think you're special," the officer continued, voice louder now, performing for an audience he hadn't realized was gathering. "But out here, you're nothing. Understand?" He tightened his grip, asserting control through pressure and proximity. The man answered softly. "I understand the instruction," he said. "I don't understand the hostility." His words were careful, chosen not to inflame, not to beg. They carried the weight of someone accustomed to command, even when stripped of it. That was when the officer smiled, not with humor, but with satisfaction. "See," he said to no one in particular. "Weak." He emphasized it again, as if repetition could make it true. The body camera blinked, recording every syllable, every breath. A neighbor's window slid open above them. Somewhere a notification chimed. The street, ordinary moments earlier, had shifted. Something irreversible had begun, though none of them yet understood how far it would go. The man remained still, breathing slow, eyes forward. The stars on his shoulder caught the light for half a second as the officer adjusted his stance. For quiet points of authority, patient, unannounced, waiting. The night pressed on, unaware that it was witnessing the first frame of a reckoning that would not stay contained to this block, this badge, or this lie. No one spoke as the cuffs hovered inches from skin. The officer's confidence filled the gap, fed by habit and the belief that nothing would challenge him here. The man's silence was mistaken for submission. Cameras kept rolling. History, patient and exact, took notes, preparing to respond in its own time. Justice had not arrived yet, but it was already moving closer, unseen, inevitable. The officer tightened his stance, positioning his body to block the sidewalk as if the space itself belonged to him. He glanced once at the small crowd forming at a cautious distance, then dismissed them with a look. Witnesses rarely mattered. They never stayed long. That belief settled comfortably in his posture. "Turn your head," he ordered. The man complied, slow and deliberate. The cuff snapped closed with metallic finality that echoed louder than expected. The sound carried. A woman across the street inhaled sharply. Someone whispered, "Record everything." The night absorbed it all. The officer guided the man off the wall and toward a patrol car, one hand firm between his shoulder blades. It wasn't violent, but it was unmistakably controlling. Each step was a reminder of who was supposed to be in charge. "You should have thought about your attitude," the officer said. "Walking around like you own the place." The man said nothing. His silence was not fear, it was restraint. He understood escalation. He understood how quickly a wrong word could become a justification. His eyes tracked the pavement, counting steps, breathing steady. He had spent years mastering composure under pressure far greater than this. At the car, the officer opened the back door and paused. He leaned in close, voice dropping low enough to feel private despite the cameras. "You know," he said, "guys like you always fold eventually. All that calm, it's fake." He laughed softly, confident in his read of the situation. Across the street, a teenager shifted, angling his phone to get a clearer view. The red recording light reflected in his glasses. Another bystander spoke up, tentative but audible. "What's he being arrested for?" The question hung unanswered. The officer straightened and addressed the air. "Suspicious behavior," he said. "Failure to comply." The words were vague, interchangeable, designed to sound official without inviting scrutiny. He closed the door, sealing the man inside the dim back seat. The lock clicked. Authority contained. Inside the car, the man sat upright, shoulders squared despite the cuffs. The glass between him and the officer reflected a faint image of his own face, calm but alert. He noticed the way the officer avoided eye contact now, moving too quickly, talking too much. Small signs, but familiar ones. The officer returned to the crowd, hands resting on his belt. "You can all move along," he said. "This is handled." No one moved. The silence was no longer empty. It was charged. Phone stayed up. A car slowed, then stopped completely. Driver watching through the windshield. "Am I being detained or arrested?" The man asked from the back seat, voice clear through the open window. It was a simple question, procedural. It landed harder than the officer expected. The officer turned sharply. "You're being arrested," he snapped, "for obstruction." The justification shifted mid-sentence, reshaping itself to fit the challenge. He felt the eyes on him now, the weight of being observed. His jaw tightened. "May I know the specific statute?" the man asked. Calm, precise, not confrontational. The kind of question that unsettled people who relied on noise instead of knowledge. The officer slammed the door shut without answering. He walked in front of the car, radio crackling as he called in the stop. His voice was louder than necessary, performative, filling the space with authority. But beneath it, something else crept in, irritation, then doubt. A woman stepped forward slightly. "He's not resisting," she said. "He hasn't done anything." Her voice shook, but she didn't retreat. Others murmured in agreement. The officer shot her a warning look. "Ma'am, step back." The man in the car closed his eyes briefly, not in defeat, but in calculation. He listened to the radio codes, the phrasing, the officer's cadence. He recognized a pattern of a situation spiraling out of control because someone refused to acknowledge a mistake. The patrol car's lights continued to strobe, bathing the street in alternating color. Time stretched. Each second added another witness, another recording, another layer that could not be erased. The officer paced once, twice, then stopped, staring at the ground as if answers might appear there. He didn't notice the 4 stars then either. Not yet. He was too busy asserting dominance, too invested in proving a point that no longer needed proving. The escalation had taken on a life of its own, fueled by pride and an audience that refused to disappear. The night waited. Pressure built quietly, invisibly. And somewhere within that pressure, the balance of power began to shift, inch by inch, toward a moment the officer could no longer control. The officer returned to the driver's side and opened the door with unnecessary force. He leaned inside, blocking the man's view of the street. "You want to play lawyer now?" he said. "You think knowing words makes you untouchable?" His tone carried a practiced contempt, the kind built from years of unchallenged encounters. The man looked up, eyes steady. "I'm asking for clarity," he said. "That's not obstruction." His voice remained even, unbroken. It did not rise to meet the officer's hostility. That restraint only deepened the imbalance. The officer straightened and slammed the door again. He turned toward the crowd, voice elevated. "This individual is being detained for interfering with an active investigation," he announced. The phrasing sounded official enough to discourage questions, though none of it aligned with what had actually occurred. A man near the curb shook his head. "We saw everything," he said quietly. "You stopped him for nothing." Several phones zoomed in tighter. The officer's jaw flexed. He pointed sharply. "You, step back or you'll be next." The threat hung there, naked and unnecessary. He paced once more, then keyed his radio. "Requesting backup," he said. "Subject is uncooperative." The word was chosen deliberately, a signal to justify whatever came next. He glanced toward the patrol car, as if expecting resistance to materialize on its own. Inside, the man adjusted his shoulders, the cuffs biting slightly as he moved. "Officer," he called out, "I am not resisting. I am complying with all lawful orders." His statement was clear, recorded, undeniable. It landed like a quiet challenge. The officer ignored him. He walked to the trunk, opened it, then closed it again without reason. A performance of control. He needed movement, something to burn off the tension creeping into his chest. The street felt different now. Smaller. Watched. Backup arrived minutes later. Another cruiser sliding in with lights flashing. A second officer stepped out, younger, eyes already scanning the crowd and the phones. He approached cautiously. "What's the situation?" he asked. "Guy got mouthy," the first officer replied. Refused to cooperate. He spoke quickly, compressing events into a narrative that favored him. The second officer glanced at the man in the back seat, then at the onlookers. Something didn't add up. "Sir," the second officer said, approaching the window. "Are you injured?" The man shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "I complied fully. I'm requesting the basis for my arrest." His tone carried authority without aggression, unsettling in its calm. The first officer cut in. "He's fine," he snapped. "We've got it handled." He stepped closer, asserting seniority through proximity. The second officer hesitated, eyes flicking again to the phones, the witnesses who hadn't moved. The first officer turned back to the man. "You think this ends well for you?" he said quietly. "Keep pushing and see what happens." It was a warning, not subtle, not legal. The body camera captured it all, blinking steadily. The man met his gaze. "Threats are unnecessary," he said. "This interaction is being documented." The words were simple, factual. They carried no emotion, only inevitability. The officer recoiled slightly, anger flaring. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job," he barked. "Out here, I decide what's necessary." He gestured broadly, encompassing the street, the night, the badge on his chest. Absolute authority, declared aloud. A woman's voice cut through. "That's not true," she said. "The law decides." Murmurs followed, a low chorus of agreement. The officer spun toward them. "That's enough," he shouted. "Clear the area." No one moved. The second officer shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should slow this down," he suggested. "Figure out what's going on." The first officer shot him a look that silenced him instantly. Hierarchy asserted, doubt suppressed. He returned to the car and opened the door again. "Step out," he ordered. The man complied carefully, feet touching pavement, movements deliberate. The officer positioned him facing the crowd, as if displaying a trophy. "See," he said. "Not so strong now." The insult landed again, louder this time. Weak. It echoed, captured by microphones, etched into memory. The man stood still, shoulders back despite the cuffs. The stars on his uniform were fully visible now, illuminated by the cruiser lights, four of them unmistakable. The officer didn't notice. He was too busy asserting power, stacking charges in his head, confident the system would protect him as it always had. He mistook restraint for surrender, silence for weakness. The misuse of authority deepened, recorded from every angle, waiting for the moment it would turn against him. The man stood cuffed beneath the flashing lights, the street quieting as if it sensed something approaching. The younger officer's gaze lingered on the uniform now, no longer just a glance, but a second look, then a third. His eyes narrowed slightly, drawn to the shoulder. "Sir," he said carefully, stepping closer, "may I ask where you're stationed?" It was a neutral question, procedural, but it cracked the surface of certainty the first officer had been standing on. The man turned his head just enough to acknowledge him. "I'm currently assigned to federal oversight," he said. "Internal operations." He paused, not for effect, but because accuracy mattered. "I'm commuting home." The first officer laughed once, sharp and dismissive. "Yeah, and I'm the governor," he said. "Save it." He reached the man's arm again, tightening his grip as if to end the conversation physically. The younger officer didn't move. His eyes were fixed now on the 4 stars. He leaned in closer, the way professionals do when something doesn't align with training. "Those insignia," he said slowly, "they're not decorative." The street seemed to lean in with him. The man nodded once. "They're not." He turned his shoulders slightly, allowing the light to fall cleanly across the stitching. 4 stars. Federal rank. Quiet authority. No patches announcing it. No bravado. Just fact. The first officer froze for half a second. Not long, but long enough. His hand loosened without permission from his mind. "That doesn't mean anything," he said quickly. "Anyone can buy a uniform." The man met his eyes for the first time since the cuffs went on. "Not this one," he said, "and not with his clearance." His voice didn't change. It didn't need to. The younger officer swallowed. He stepped back, creating space where there had been none. "Dispatch," he said into his radio, voice controlled but tight. "Can you confirm federal identification, last name?" He stopped, looking to the man. "Marshall," the man said. "Director level." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need witnesses to hear it. The word carried its own weight. The radio crackled. A pause, then a tone shift. "Unit 12, dispatch," replied, suddenly precise, suddenly careful. "Stand by." The first officer's confidence drained in stages. First the smile vanished, then the posture. He glanced at the crowd, at the phone still raised, at the second cruiser, at the man he had called weak. His mouth opened, closed, recalibrating. "That's not possible," he said. If this were real, you would have said something." The man shook his head slightly. "Authority doesn't need to announce itself," he said. "It only needs to be lawful." He turned his wrist slightly, the cuffs catching the light. "These aren't." Silence pressed down, heavier than before. The younger officer stepped forward again, this time with purpose. "Sir," he said to the man, "I apologize for the delay." He turned to the first officer. "We need to remove the restraints." "What?" The word escaped before it could be filtered. "No. Hold on." Panic edged in now, sharp and unmistakable. "We haven't verified anything." The radio answered for him. "Unit 12, dispatch," said, "confirmation received. Subject is cleared federal oversight. Rank verified. Stand down." The crowd reacted in a low wave of sound. Gasps. Murmurs. Phones adjusted, framing the moment. The first officer stepped back as if struck. "This is a misunderstanding," he said quickly. "We were just procedure." The man watched him steadily. "Procedure requires cause," he said. "You had none." The cuffs came off. The metal sound loud final. The younger officer handed them back without meeting the first officer's eyes. The man rolled his wrist once, then straightened his uniform. The 4 stars had openly now, undeniable. He looked at the first officer, not with anger, but with assessment. "You call me weak," he said. "You assumed silence meant submission." He paused. "You were wrong on both counts." The first officer stood speechless, exposed not by force, but by process. His authority had inverted in real time, using the very rules he claimed to enforce. Cameras captured it all. The moment power realized it no longer belonged where it thought it did. The night exhaled. The reckoning had arrived, not loudly, but precisely, and it was only beginning. The shift was immediate, but not chaotic. It moved with the cold efficiency of protocol, finally waking up. The younger officer stepped back, posture corrected, eyes forward. The first officer remained where he was, suddenly unsure where to put his hands. The badge on his chest looked heavier now, less like armor and more like evidence. "Supervisor en route." Dispatch said, voice clipped, professional. ETA 3 minutes. The word supervisor landed like a verdict. The man, Director Marshall, did not gloat. He didn't step closer. He simply stood free now, while the first officer stood trapped inside the consequences of his own actions. The crowd stayed. No one needed to be told to keep recording anymore. Instinct had taken over. 3 minutes stretched into an eternity for the officer who had started this. He tried to speak, to fill the silence with explanations, but every sentence collapsed before leaving his mouth. The street no longer belonged to him. Control had slipped quietly, cleanly, without resistance. A black SUV arrived first, unmarked, then another patrol unit. A sergeant stepped out, older, composed, eyes already taking inventory. He didn't rush. He didn't ask what happened right away. He looked at the crowd, the phones, the cuffs now hanging uselessly in the officer's side. Then he looked at the 4 stars. His expression changed, subtle but unmistakable. He walked directly to Marshall and stopped at a respectful distance. "Sir," he said, "I'm Sergeant Collins. I understand there's been an issue." Marshall nodded once. "There has," he said, "and it's been fully documented." He gestured lightly toward the street, the witnesses, the blinking cameras. "By more people than your department usually answers to." Collins turned slowly toward the first officer. "Badge number," he said. The officer recited it automatically, voice tight. "Step over here," Collins said, not loudly, not angrily. The tone was worse than that. Final. As the officer moved, Collins continued, "You initiated this stop on what grounds?" "Suspicious behavior," the officer said. The words sounded thin now, stripped of authority. Collins glanced at Marshall. "Sir, I was walking home from work," Marshall said. "In uniform. I complied with every instruction. I was insulted, threatened, detained without cause, and cuffed." He paused. "I was called weak." The word hung there, stripped of its earlier power, now grotesque in the open air. Collins nodded slowly. He turned back to the officer. "Is that accurate?" The officer hesitated. Cameras closed in. "Hungry. I was maintaining control of the situation." "No," Collins said calmly. "You were creating one." He reached out. "Your weapon." The officer blinked. "Sergeant." "Now." The gun came off first, then the taser, then the radio. Each item placed into Collins' hands felt like a small dismantling. Authority disassembled piece by piece, in front of everyone. "You're relieved of duty pending investigation," Collins said. "You'll remain here." The officer's face flushed, then drained. "This is excessive," he said. He didn't identify himself. Marshall spoke before Collins could. "I am not required to identify myself to avoid mistreatment," he said. "Neither is any citizen." Silence followed. The crowd absorbed it. Phones captured it. Somewhere, a live stream count ticked upward. Another vehicle arrived, this one unmistakably federal. 2 agents stepped out, suits under jackets, movements economical. They approached Marshall, nodding respectfully. One leaned in briefly. "Sir, we've already flagged the footage," he said quietly. "It's spreading." Marshall exhaled once. Not relief. Resolve. "Good," he said. "Then it won't disappear." The first officer watched as control fully left his reach. He was no longer the center of the scene. He was a subject in it. Bystanders no longer looked at him with fear or avoidance. They looked with something colder. Judgment. Collins turned to him again. "You'll provide a statement," he said. "Then you'll go home." He paused. "Badge and uniform stay here." The officer swallowed. "You can't." "I can," Collins said. "And I am." The uniform came off piece by piece. The gesture wasn't theatrical. It was procedural. That made it worse. Each removal echoed louder than any shouted reprimand could have. Across the street, someone whispered, "I've never seen this happen." Another replied, "That's because it usually doesn't." Marshall watched quietly as the process unfolded. This wasn't about personal satisfaction. It was about correction. About making sure the system, for once, didn't flinch. The next morning, The video was everywhere. Not edited, not sensationalized. Just raw footage. The stop, the insult, the cuffs, the stars, the reversal. The word week became a headline, then a question, then an indictment. By noon, the department released a statement. "We are aware of the incident," it read. "An internal investigation is underway." It was cautious language, but the damage was already done. By evening, the officer's name was known. His prior complaints resurfaced. Patterns emerged. Similar stops. Similar language. Different victims. The same silence that had protected him before now worked against him. 2 days later, he was formally suspended without pay. A week later, charges were announced. Unlawful detention, violation of civil rights, conduct unbecoming. The union tried to intervene. The footage stopped him cold. Marshall testified once. Briefly, factually, he didn't embellish. He didn't need to. The video spoke for him. The officer watched the proceedings from the back of the room, smaller now, stripped of certainty. He avoided the cameras that had once avoided him. When the verdict came, termination, decertification, referral for prosecution, it wasn't met with cheers, just a collective exhale. Accountability, delivered without spectacle. Outside, reporters asked Marshall how it felt. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about what happens when authority forgets it serves the public." He paused. Tonight, it remembered. The consequence phase did not end there. Departments nationwide circulated the footage in training modules. The officer's actions became a case study, not as an anomaly, but as a warning. And for the first time in a long while, the system didn't look away. The footage didn't fade the way most viral moments did. It didn't get buried under the next outrage cycle or soften into a talking point. It stayed. Departments replayed it in briefing rooms. City councils referenced it in closed sessions. Civil oversight boards flagged it as a threshold moment, the kind that forced policy to move instead of stall. Within weeks, the department announced procedural changes. Stops based solely on suspicious behavior now required articulable criteria logged in real time. Body camera audio could no longer be muted during citizen interaction. Officers were mandated to verbally state the legal basis for detention before restraints could be applied. None of it was revolutionary. That was the point. The rules had always existed. Now they were being enforced. Training modules were rewritten, not expanded, rewritten. Recruits watched the footage from start to finish without commentary. No narration, no defense, just a raw interaction and its outcome. Then the consequences, the decertification, the charges. Instructors didn't ask how the officer could have protected himself. They asked how the citizens' rights had been violated and how easily power had slipped into abuse. The officer's name became a footnote in departmental memos, not erased, but fixed in place as a reference point. "This is what happens," supervisor said quietly, "when you forget who the law is for." Federal oversight followed, not dramatic raids or public condemnations, but audits, ride-alongs, pattern reviews. Complaints once dismissed as isolated were re-examined together. A pattern emerged where one had never officially existed before. Settlements followed. Policies adjusted again. Marshall declined interviews. He didn't write a book. He didn't accept speaking fees. When asked why, he answered simply, this shouldn't require a spokesperson. But he did return to work. Quietly, methodically. He reviewed cases like his own, ones without 4 stars, without leverage, without witnesses. Some were reopened. Some were dismissed. Some resulted in discipline that had been avoided for years. The process was slow, but it moved. For the public, something shifted too. The footage became shorthand, not for anger, but for expectation. People referenced it when asking questions, when asserting rights, when refusing to be intimidated. "Say it on camera" became a phrase with weight behind it. Departments noticed. Encounters changed. Not everywhere, not always, but enough to matter. The officer who started it all disappeared from the force entirely. No quiet reassignment. No early retirement. His appeal failed. His certification was revoked permanently. He found work elsewhere, far from authority, far from a badge. The system did not chase him. It simply closed the door behind him and locked it. The reform wasn't perfect. It never is. But it was real, measurable, traceable to a single night where power was exposed not by shouting, not by force, but by patience, evidence, and a refusal to accept humiliation as normal. The street where it happened went back to being ordinary. No plaque, no memorial, just a place where something important had occurred, then moved outward. Accountability didn't announce itself. It didn't need to. It did its work and stayed. The night that began with an insult ended without applause. No one raised a fist. No one shouted victory. Justice, when it finally arrived, did so quietly, the way it often does when it's real. Marshall walked home afterward, the same route he had planned to take before the sirens, before the word week was thrown like a verdict. The street looked unchanged, but it wasn't. Neither was the system that had been forced, however briefly, to look at itself without excuses. What lingered wasn't the humiliation. It was the correction, the proof that calm dignity could outlast arrogance, that rules, when documented and witnessed, could still turn power back on itself, that silence, when chosen, was not surrender. For those who watched the footage later, something settled in. Not rage, expectation, the understanding that accountability is not mythical, just rare, and that rarity depends on whether moments are recorded, remembered, and demanded to matter. This wasn't a story about a uniform with 4 stars. It was about what happens when authority forgets its limits, and what happens when someone refuses to forget their rights. If this story held your attention, let it do more than that. Remember it. Share it, because systems don't reform themselves. They respond to light. And sometimes all it takes is one night, one camera, and one person who stays standing long enough for the truth to catch up.